History is filled with brilliant military commanders. Some won great victories. Some built mighty empires. But almost all of them eventually lost. One man never did. Before the age of 33, he had marched thousands of miles, defeated every army that stood in his path, and created one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. From Greece to Egypt, across Persia and into the edge of India, kingdom after kingdom fell before him. His name was Alexander. To his soldiers, he was a fearless commander who fought beside them on the front lines. To his enemies, he seemed impossible to stop. Time and again, he faced armies that outnumbered his own, yet somehow walked away victorious. His success wasn't built on luck. It wasn't because he always had the larger army. And it certainly wasn't because his enemies were weak. He faced some of the most powerful kingdoms of his age, commanded by experienced rulers with greater wealth, larger forces, and every advantage they could hope for. Yet battle after battle, Alexander found a way to win. More than 2,000 years later, military academies still study his campaigns, searching for the principles that made him one of history's greatest commanders. So what made him different? How did a young king from a relatively small kingdom achieve something no one else could? And why did the empire he built begin to crumble almost as quickly as it was created? To answer that, we have to return to the beginning, long before he became known as Alexander the Great. Long before he commanded armies, Alexander was a prince with expectations unlike any other. He was born into the kingdom of Macedon, a rising power on the northern edge of Greece. His father, King Philip II, had transformed Macedon into one of the strongest military states in the region. From an early age, Alexander watched how kingdoms were won, not through chance, but through discipline, strategy, and preparation. His education was just as extraordinary. Alexander was taught by the renowned philosopher Aristotle, who introduced him to history, science, literature, and philosophy. He learned that a great leader needed more than strength. He needed knowledge, curiosity, and the ability to understand both allies and enemies. But books alone could never prepare him for the battlefield. As a teenager, Alexander trained relentlessly with weapons, rode horses for hours, and accompanied his father on military campaigns. One of the most famous stories from his youth tells of a wild horse named Bucephalus. While others saw an uncontrollable animal, Alexander noticed it was frightened by its own shadow. By turning the horse toward the sun, he calmed it and earned a companion that would carry him through many of his greatest victories. It was a small moment, but it revealed something important. Alexander didn't simply face problems with force. He looked for what others had failed to see. That ability would soon be tested on a much larger stage. Because when tragedy struck the Macedonian throne, the young prince would have only one chance to prove he was ready, not as a student, but as a king. In 336 BC, everything changed in a single moment. King Philip II was assassinated during a public celebration, leaving the kingdom of Macedon without its powerful ruler. At just 20 years old, Alexander suddenly found himself wearing the crown, but inheriting a throne was far easier than keeping it. Almost immediately, rivals sensed weakness. Some Macedonian nobles questioned whether someone so young could rule. Neighboring tribes prepared to revolt, believing the kingdom would collapse without Philip. Even several Greek city-states saw an opportunity to break free from Macedonian control. Alexander had a choice. He could spend years negotiating with his enemies, or he could act before they had time to unite. He chose speed. Moving with astonishing determination, Alexander secured the loyalty of his army, crushed rebellions in Macedon, and marched south into Greece. When the city of Thebes revolted, he responded with overwhelming force. The rebellion was crushed, sending a clear message across the region. The young king was every bit as dangerous as his father. Within months, the challenges that had threatened to destroy his reign had disappeared. Alexander was no longer seen as an inexperienced prince. He was now the unquestioned ruler of Macedon. But restoring his kingdom was never his ultimate goal. Across the Aegean Sea lay the greatest empire the world had ever known, the mighty Persian Empire. And Alexander believed it could be conquered. To most people, Alexander's next decision seemed impossible. The Persian Empire stretched across 3 continents. It controlled vast cities, enormous wealth, and millions of people. Its king, Darius III, commanded an army far larger than anything Macedon could field. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. Alexander shouldn't have stood a chance. Yet in 334 BC, he led his army across the Hellespont into Asia, beginning one of the boldest military campaigns in history. He wasn't just invading a neighboring kingdom, he was challenging the most powerful empire of his age. From the very beginning, Alexander refused to fight on his enemy's terms. Instead of waiting to be overwhelmed by superior numbers, he relied on speed, discipline, and surprise. His army moved with remarkable efficiency, striking before larger Persian forces could fully coordinate their response. At battles such as the Granicus, Issus, and later Gaugamela, he identified weaknesses in seemingly invincible armies and attacked with relentless precision. Again and again, the impossible happened. Larger armies retreated. Powerful cities surrendered. Even King Darius III was forced to flee the battlefield more than once. With every victory, Alexander's reputation grew. Some began to see him as unbeatable. Others believed fortune itself was on his side. But Alexander knew the truth. Winning wasn't about luck. It was about leading an army in a way no one else could. So what was the secret that allowed him to defeat stronger enemies again and again without ever losing a battle? Alexander's greatest weapon wasn't his sword. It was the way he thought. Unlike many kings, he didn't command his army from a safe distance. He rode at the front, leading cavalry charges alongside his soldiers. Every victory, and every risk, was shared with the men who fought beside him. That earned him something few commanders ever achieved: absolute loyalty. His army was just as remarkable. The Macedonian phalanx advanced like a moving fortress, its soldiers carrying long spears called sarissas that could reach enemy lines before shorter weapons ever could. While the phalanx held opponents in place, Alexander struck with his elite companion cavalry, attacking exactly where the enemy was weakest. But tactics alone don't explain his success. Alexander constantly adapted. He studied the terrain, anticipated his opponent's decisions, and changed his plans when the battle demanded it. Rather than relying on overwhelming force, he relied on timing, coordination, and surprise. Again and again, these principles turned impossible battles into stunning victories. By now, Alexander had conquered Egypt, defeated the Persian Empire, and marched farther east than any Macedonian king before him. His empire stretched across thousands of miles. For many rulers, that would have been enough. For Alexander, it was only the beginning. He believed there were still new lands to conquer beyond the horizon. But the farther he marched from home, the greater the challenge became, not from his enemies, but from the very army that had made all his victories possible. Could even an undefeated commander keep asking his soldiers to march into the unknown? Alexander's empire now stretched farther than anyone had imagined possible. But he wasn't finished. Driven by an unrelenting desire to explore and conquer, he led his army deeper into Asia, eventually reaching the frontiers of India. The journey grew harder with every mile. Soldiers marched through scorching deserts, crossed powerful rivers, and fought in unfamiliar lands against determined opponents. One of the greatest challenges came at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, where Alexander faced King Porus and an army that included something his men had rarely encountered on such a scale: war elephants. Despite the unfamiliar threat, Alexander adapted his tactics once again and emerged victorious. It was another remarkable triumph. But this victory came at a cost. For nearly a decade, his soldiers had been campaigning almost without pause. They had crossed continents, endured countless battles, and traveled thousands of miles from home. Rumors spread of even larger kingdoms waiting farther east, with armies unlike anything they had faced before. This time, the obstacle wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. When Alexander urged his men to continue, they refused. They had followed him through every battle, but they could go no farther. For the first time in his career, Alexander encountered an opponent he could not overcome. Not an enemy king. Not a mighty empire. But the limits of his own army. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Babylon. He remained undefeated in battle. Yet fate was about to confront him with a challenge no military genius could defeat. In 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon at the height of his power. He was only 32 years old, yet his empire stretched from Greece and Egypt to the borders of India. No enemy had defeated him. No battlefield had broken him. And despite years of constant campaigning, he was already planning new expeditions, with Arabia believed to be among his next ambitions. Then, without warning, everything changed. After several days of illness, Alexander died. The exact cause remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Ancient sources describe a sudden fever and declining health, but historians continue to debate whether disease, complications from old wounds, or another cause was responsible. No explanation has ever been proven with certainty. His death created a crisis that no battle plan could solve. Alexander had conquered an empire, but he had left no clear successor capable of holding it together. Almost immediately, his leading generals began competing for power. The vast realm he had spent years building fractured into rival kingdoms, each claiming a piece of his legacy. The man who had never lost a battle could not prevent the one outcome every conqueror eventually faces. Time moved on. Empires changed. Borders shifted. But Alexander's name endured. More than 2,000 years later, people still ask the same question. How could one young king achieve what so many others believed was impossible? More than 2,000 years have passed since Alexander's final campaign. The empire he built no longer exists. Its borders disappeared long ago, and the kingdoms that emerged after his death eventually faded into history. But Alexander's influence never did. Military academies around the world still study his campaigns, not because he had the largest army, but because he consistently outthought larger and more powerful opponents. His emphasis on speed, decisive action, adaptability, and leading from the front continues to shape military strategy even today. His conquests also transformed the ancient world in ways that reached far beyond the battlefield. As his armies advanced, they carried Greek language, art, science, and ideas across vast regions. Cities were founded, cultures mixed, and knowledge spread between civilizations, creating a lasting legacy that historians call the Hellenistic Age. Yet Alexander's story also carries an important lesson. Winning battles is not the same as building something that lasts. He achieved what few thought possible, conquering an empire that stretched across continents without ever suffering a defeat in battle. But preserving that empire proved to be a challenge greater than any army he faced. Perhaps that is why history remembers him so vividly. Not simply because he was undefeated, but because he showed what extraordinary vision, courage, and determination could accomplish in a single lifetime. Some conquerors are remembered for the lands they ruled. Alexander is remembered for changing the limits of what humanity believed was possible.